Hello, and welcome back to another episode of the Western Canon Challenge, where we are reading the entirety of the Western literary canon out loud. Today, we are continuing our reading of the Journals of Ralph Waldo Emerson. We concluded with the end of Journal 2, and today we are starting Journal 3, also in quotations, number 18, and it dates from 1820 and it begins with an annotation, and we'll go from there. Between or contemporary with Wide Worlds, numbers 1 and 2, is a manuscript book marked as above, number 18, a few specimens from which are here given. Besides these, it contains notes on college lectures and extracts copied from the books he was reading. Also, some very juvenile criticism of Wordsworth, especially The Excursion, and notes for his prized dissertation on the present state of ethical philosophy, which, as has been said, Rev. Dr. Edward Everett Hale printed, with that on Socrates accompanying his sketch of Emerson. The notebook also has fragments on the religion of the Middle Ages, religious tendencies of different states of society, on poetry, etc. Of romance also there are a few pages, The Magician, and an unnamed one about a witch wife, also various scraps of verse, including part of a ballad on King Richard. But much space is given in this and some of the following Wide Worlds to a discussion of the drama, especially in America. He attacks it in a daring and violent manner, praising the Greek tragedies, but his youthful sense of morality is outraged by the grossness of passages in the Elizabethan dramatists, and his taste disgusted by the degeneracy of the later drama. It must be borne in mind, however, first, that it is doubtful whether the youth had ever been inside of a playhouse. Second, that the writings in question were probably prepared for a debate in the Pythologian Society, in which he had his part assigned. Hence, do not exactly represent Emerson's views at the time, especially as somewhat later he adopts a much less stringent tone and believes that the theater in America might be reformed and become an elevating influence from which, however, Shakespeare, with all his charms, must be excluded unless severely expurgated. Number 18, Boston, September 22nd, 1820. Where dost thou careless lie, buried in ease and sloth? Knowledge that sleeps doth die, and this security, it is the common moth, which eats on wits and arts, and quite destroys them both. Are all the Aeonian springs dried up? Lies Thespia waste? Does Clarius' harp want strings? Not that a nymph now sings, or droop they as disgraced, to see their seats and bowers by chattering pies and defaced. Ben Jonson to himself. Drama. Campbell, the poet, said to Professor Everett that the only chance which America has for a truly national literature is to be found in the drama. We are bound to reverence such high authority, and at least to examine the correctness of the position. Few speculations have such a charm in their nature as this, whose object is how to conduct a dialogue between a man and his fellow just far enough removed from common life to avoid disgust, while it must claim the attention and elevate the tone of feeling. In the nation, which has always been regarded as the model in all the arts, the fountain of all polished letters, and the pattern of all time, the drama was invented, and there alone succeeded perfectly. All inquiries, therefore, upon this subject begin from Greece. The history and influence of tragedy, its modes and machines of operation, must be explained from these sources. Tragedy, by exciting the emotions of fear and of pity, tends to correct the same affections in the soul. This has been all along esteemed the philosophy of tragedy, with what correctness we shall not pretend to determine. But these ends were answered in Greece, and more than this, a respect for the gods was effectually inculcated. The thraldom of superstition was made useful to shackle those whom the light and law of natural religion could not guide, And he whom the beauty of moral rectitude could not win was afraid to face the temple of the Furies, and averted his head as he passed by it. But by whom was this powerful influence created over a people whose refined taste kept a watchful eye on the artist, so that it should not be seduced unawares, and never yielded save to the irresistible might of genius? In what schools did they purchase the subtle art which became in their hands an instrument of such power? This question is the most important which can be asked, for it develops the causes of their preeminence. It was not the robed disciple at ease in the academy who gained the prize of tragedy, but Aeschylus was a son of the Republic who had fought valiantly at Marathon and Plataea, and came bleeding from the battle to assemble in a simple natural plot the personages of old traditions, and attribute to them the feelings he had just felt, and place them in circumstances in which himself had been placed. Miraculous effects have been recorded of their representation, but by whom and how were they performed? In answer to this, we all know how the primitive stage differed from the modern, that all was on the magnificent scale, that the actors were transformed to giants, and the strength of their voices increased by metallic mouthpiece. But that which formed their chief distinction were their independent habits of feeling, of sentiment, of invention. This is illustrated by an anecdote of their theater. Polus, the first actor on the stage, was preparing to perform the part of Electra. In this piece, Electra embraces the urn supposed to hold the remains of Orestes. The Greek actor ordered that the urn containing the ashes of his own son should be brought from the tomb and conveyed to the theater. And when, on the stage, this urn was offered to him, and the father bent over it, he rent the air with no mimic grief or insincere howlings, but the whole audience was melted with the moving picture of his grief and lamentation. When the light had failed from the Greek theater, which those masters had poured upon it, it would have violated the common order of events had an equal illumination been rekindled. The frivolous comic muse, hitherto of slight esteem, grew into favor and trode fast on the steps of sceptred tragedy. The witty and offensive Aristophanes parodied the eloquent declamation of Euripides, mimicked the awful port of princes and gods, and converted the general satire of the old comedians into a vicious personal ribaldry. Finally, the civil authority interfered to stop its flagrant abuses. The tragedy was not inherited by Rome, which scrupulously incorporated all the arts of Athens. It was too delicate a treasure to be lightly transmitted by instruction or won with the spoils. In France, during the Dark Ages, the castle of feudal chieftains witnessed a second rude drama, the name and character of which is all that remains. The Mysteries served to show that it was a natural expression of the human feelings. In England, the progress was somewhat similar, but the first productions, which were marked for fame or works of prodigious power, and their origin is sudden and unaccountable. From an obscurity which none had illuminated since Chaucer's era, there suddenly issued a series of elegant and original performances, equal in power to the masterpieces of Greece, and adorned by a strain of such delicate feeling, and the wisdom of solid and rare philosophy, and verse wherein was breathed the very melody of nature to arrest the soul withal. Over all this fair miracle, a hideous corruption was spread, which made every page offensive. It is wonderful how intimately health and poison, beauty and destruction, can combine, and nowhere shall we find such a fatal illustration. The inhabitants of England have sat down rejoicing in the light which Shakespeare's genius had shed around them, unconscious or careless of the defilement which attends us. Shall we be told that Shakespeare painted nature as he found it, that we only see here what we see elsewhere in the scenes of life daily? No, he paints nature not in innocence and its primitive condition, but not until it has become depraved itself, and its exhibition will deprave others, nor is the general moral which is to be deduced from the whole pure. Shakespeare assumed the commanding attitude of bold, unrivaled genius, Men saw that the inspiration was genuine, and few were so scrupulous as to ask if all were there. The statue is colossal, but its diabolical features poison our admiration for the genius which conceived in the skilful hand which carved it. The exact sciences. Of all the sciences, the science of the mind is necessarily the most worthy and elevating. But it cannot precede the others. Natural philosophy and mathematics must be sought in order to gain first the comforts of civilized life, and then the data whence our moral reasonings proceed. It is an old saying that all are a circle and necessarily depend on one another, that great improvements in astronomy involve a knowledge of mathematics, and so of the others. We exist to moral purposes and are proud to call ourselves intellectual beings. Hence, one would say, leave matter to the beasts that are only matter, and indulge your peculiar distinguishing faculties. But then our reason and all our mental powers are called into as active exercises in demonstrating the properties of matter as the properties of mind, and the beasts are alike incapable of both. So your plea confutes itself. With regard, then, to the study of natural philosophy, I do not think any one study so contributes to expand the mind as our first correct notions of this science. When we first know that the sky is not a shell, but a vacant space, that the world is not still and plain, but a little globe performing as one of a system immense revolutions. Poem. Dedication. And this is in, looks like Latin. And it's listed Virgilian lot, and I do not read Latin, so I cannot read what this says. But a poem follows from here, and in parentheses it says, "This song to one whose unimproved talents and unattained friendship have interested the writer in his character and fate." And the poem follows here. By unacknowledged tie which binds us to each other, by the pride of feeling high which friendship's name can smother, by the cold encountering eyes whose language deeply thrilling rebelled against the prompt surmise which told the heart was willing, by all which you have felt and feel, my eager glance returning, I offered to this silent zeal on youthful altars burning. All the classic hours which fill the little urn of honor, Minerva guide and pay the pen your hand conferred upon her. Back to the journal. Translation of Montaigne to Monsieur Charon. May fortune bless thee, and friends caress thee, remote from care, but loved by me, the gifts of pleasure and boundless treasure, not withheld, but poured on thee. Garlanded with roses, at eve thy friend reposes, yet look for joys that boundless be. Ralph Waldo Emerson. When Jove's grey daughter, beldam Care, on crimson couches first was laid, her thousand wrinkled children there scowled on poor man, to all betrayed. There was a little fairy then of crooked form, whose name was S, who bade the miscreants join to form a smiling cherub, height caress. Quote, "Doth not the queen of the woods gather the secrets of futurity when she reads the decaying oak leaves? And can she not tell the young man how to guide his steps in life?" End quote. The annotated footnote says, "Question of a youth to a weird woman," in a fragment of a fairy story of Ralph Waldo Emerson's. Journal 4. The Wide World Number 2. Annotated note here. Emerson was now a senior, 17 years old, and with his loved brother Edward Bliss Emerson, who had just entered the freshman class, occupied room number 9, Hollis. October 1820. I have determined to grant a new charter to my pen, having finished my commonplace book, which I commenced in January, and with as much success as I was ambitious of, whose whole aim was the small utility of being the exchequer to the accumulating store of organized verbs, nouns, and substantives, to wit, sentences. It has been a source of entertainment and accomplished its end, and on this account has induced me to repeat, or rather continue the experiment. Wherefore on. To forget for a season the world and its concerns, and to separate the soul for sublime contemplation till it has lost the sense of circumstances, and is decking itself in plumage drawn out from the gay wardrobe of fancy, is a recreation and a rapture of which few men can avail themselves. But this privilege, in common with other great gifts of nature, is attainable, if not inborn. It is denied altogether to three classes at least of mankind, viz., the queer, the downright, and the ungainly. This is by no means a careless or fanciful classification, although rather a restricted sense belongs to the epithets. By "the queer," I understand those animals of oddity whose disgusting eccentricity flows from a conceited character and the lack of common sense. I characterize the downright only as people who do jobs, and the ungainly points exclusively at some quaint lantern countenances, who have at one time and another shocked my nerves and nauseated my taste by their hideous aspects. With cautious explanation, we advance from these degraded stages of intellect, this doleful frontispiece of creation, to prouder orders of mind. Ordinary men claim the intermittent exercises of this power of beautiful abstraction, but to the souls only of the mightiest is it given to command the disappearance of land and sea, and mankind and things, and they vanish. Then comes the enchanter, illuminating the glorious vision with hues from heaven, granting thoughts of other worlds, gilded with luster of ravishment and delight, till the hours, teeming with loveliness and joy, roll by uncounted. Exulting in the exercise of this prerogative, the poet, truly called so, has entreated the reluctant permission. "And forever shalt thou dwell in the spirit of the spell." October 6th, 1820. I have listened this evening to an eloquent lecture of the elegant professor of French and Spanish literature on the subject of the extent of the language, a subject which bears on the face of it dullness and dread. Every soul presently warmly acknowledged the force of delineation, when the great deluge of the French language, sweeping down all the feeble barriers of ephemeral dialects, carried captive the languages and literature of all Europe, while in the commotions of politics the German thrones were dashed to pieces against each other on this great and wide sea. And here is a poem, it looks like. Where, robed in light, the genii of the stars launch in refulgent space their diamond cars, or in pavilions of celestial pride, serene above all influence beside, vent the bold joy which swells the glorious soul, rich with rapture of secure control. Onward, around their golden visions stray, till only glory can their range delay. Well, I begin with prose and have mustered up to 10 lines of poetry, which will answer rarely to lighten the labor of the next theme. It is 10:30, and time to put away the wide world and its concerns, and consign my indolent limbs to comfortable repose. Ergo, cease my pen, "to witch the world with noble penmanship." October 12th. I should write a theme this morning, but cruel destiny forbids the thought of rainbow colors to rise. I want to write poetry to add when bounding, etc. October 15th. Different mortals improve resources of happiness which are entirely different. This I find more apparent in the familiar instances obvious at college recitations. My more fortunate neighbors exult in the display of mathematical study, while I, after feeling the humiliating sense of dependence and inferiority, which, like the goading, soul-sickening sense of extreme poverty, palsy's effort, esteem myself abundantly compensated, if with my pen I can marshal whole catalogues of nouns and verbs to express to the life the imbecility I felt. Mr. Everett says, quote, "The shout of admiration is lost ere it reaches the arches of heaven, but there is an all-seeing eye which looks deep down into the recesses of the obscurest heart. It is a small matter to abstain from vice to which there is no temptation, or to perform a virtue which is standing by you with crowns for your head, but it is the obscure, struggling, unsuccessful virtue which meets with reward." Exhibition night. This tumultuous day is done. The character of its thought weather is always extremely singular, fuller than any other day of great thoughts and poets' dreams, of hope and joy and pride, and then closed with merriment and wine, evincing or eliciting gay, fraternal feeling enough, but brutalized and defiled with excess of physical enjoyment, leaving the mind distracted and unfit for pursuits of soberness. Barnwell's oration contains sublime images. One was of great power, a terrible description of the fire tempest which overshadowed Sodom and Gomorrah. Another description of the waterspout of the Pacific was noble. A great struggle of ambition is going on between Barnwell and Upham. Thundering and lightning are faint and tame descriptions of the course of astonishing eloquence. You double the force of painting if you describe it as it is. The flashing eye that fills up the chasms of language, the living brow, throwing meaning and intellect into every furrow and every frown, the stamping foot, the laboring limbs, the desperate gesture, these must all be seen in their strong exercise before the vivid conception of their effect can be adequately felt. And then a man must separate and discipline and intoxicate his mind before he can enjoy the glory of the orator. When mighty thoughts come crowding on the soul, he must learn to harrow up unwelcome recollections and concentrate woe and horror and disgust till his own heart sickens. He must stretch forth his arm and array the bright ideas which have settled around him till they gather to forceful and appalling sublimity. October 24th. I begin to believe in the Indian doctrine of eye fascination. The cold blue eye of blank has so intimately connected him with my thoughts and visions that a dozen times a day, and as often by night, I find myself wholly wrapped up in conjectures of his character and inclinations. We have already 2 or 3 long profound stares at each other. Be it wise or weak or superstitious, I must know him. Here follows a poem. Perhaps thy lot in life is higher than the fates assigned to me, while they fulfill thy large desire and bid my hopes as visions flee. But grant me still in joy or sorrow, in grief or hope, to claim thy heart, and I will then defy the morrow whilst I fulfill a loyal part. And a note says, these verses have a paper over them arranged so that it can be turned up, and on the paper in an India ink profile and bust, presumably a memory sketch of Gay. October 25th. I find myself often idle, vagrant, stupid, and hollow. This is somewhat appalling, and if I do not discipline myself with diligent care, I shall suffer severely from remorse and the sense of inferiority hereafter. All around me are industrious and will be great. I am indolent and shall be insignificant. Avert it, heaven, avert it, virtue, I need excitement. November 1st. My opinion of blank was strangely lowered by hearing that he was quote-unquote proverbially idle. This was redeemed by learning that he was quote-unquote a superior man. This week, a little eventful in college, has brought a share of its accidents to him. On the following page here is a memory sketch of Martin Gay. So the first name of this man was Martin Gay, and it was made by Emerson in his journal for 1821. Back to the journal. November 2nd. What a grand man was Milton, so marked by nature for the great epic poet that was to bear up the name of these latter times. In Reason of Church Government urged against prelaty, written while young, his spirit is already communing with itself and stretching out in its colossal proportions and yearning for the destiny he was appointed to fulfill. November 10th. The abbot must be its author, a source of unmixed delight and unchastened pride. November 10th. A recipe! Young Waldo, when in your thick coming whims you feel an itching to engrave, take a piece of glass and cover it with a thin film of wax or isinglass and trace the proposed figure with a steel point. Place this over a vessel containing a mixture of powdered fluorspar and sulfuric acid gently heated. The acid gas coming into contact with the uncovered parts of the glass combines with and removes the silex, as well probably as the alkali with which it is united, and lines more or less deep are thus formed, according to Gorman's Chemistry, article Silicon, page 265, volume 1. Observe this. Mr. Everett notices that a temperate climate has always been found necessary to a high national character. Also, Mr. Waldo, if you would like to find the sublimest attainable sayings on the destruction of nations, vide fourth book of the Sibylline Collections. November 18th. I shall subjoin some recipes for the terrible void which ruins ever and anon the mind's peace, and is otherwise called unhappiness. 1. Take Scott's novels and read carefully the mottos of the chapters, or if you prefer reading a novel itself, take The Bride of Lammermoor. 2. Sometimes, in parentheses, seldom, the finest parts of Cowper's Task will answer the purpose. I refer to the home scenes. 3. For the same reason that I would take Scott's mottos, I would also take an old tragedy such as Ben Jonson's Otway's Congreves. In short, anything of that kind which leads as far as possible from the usual trains of thought. 4. Make recipes to add to this list. December 4th, 1820. Here at Cambridge in my cheerless schoolroom, Sunday evening I heard Mr. Everett preach at the Old South a charity sermon, one of his most, perhaps the most eloquent efforts. December 5th. It appears to me that it is a secret of the art of eloquence to know that a powerful aid would be derived from the use of forms of language which were generally known to men in their infancy, and which now, under another and unknown garb, but forcibly reminding them of early impressions, are likely to be mistaken for opinions whose beginning they cannot recollect, and therefore suppose them innate. At least, if by such operation they cannot convince the mind, they may serve to win attention by this awakening but ambiguous charm. By these forms of language, I mean a paraphrase of some sentence in a primer or other child's book common to the country. The spell would be more perfect, perhaps, if, instead of such a paraphrase, the words of a sentence should be modulated to the cadence of the aforesaid infant literature. I dare not subjoin an example. The human soul, the world, the universe are laboring on to their magnificent consummation. We are not fashioned thus marvelously for naught. The straining conceptions of man, the monuments of his reason, and the whole furniture of his faculties is, adapted to mightier views of things than the mightiest he has yet beheld. Roll on, then, thou stupendous universe, in sublime, incomprehensible solitude, in an unbeheld but sure path. The finger of God is pointing out your way, and when ages shall have elapsed and time is no more, while the stars shall fall from heaven, and the sun become darkness, and the moon blood, human intellect, purified and sublimed, shall mount to perfection of unmeasured and ineffable enjoyment of knowledge and glory. Man shall come to the presence of Jehovah in the manner of Chateaubriand. December 15th. I claim and clasp a moment's respite from this irksome school to saunter in the fields of my own wayward thought. The afternoon was gloomy and preparing to snow, dull, ugly weather. But when I came out from the hot, steaming stove, stinking, dirty A.B. spelling schoolroom, I almost soared and mounted the atmosphere at breathing the free, magnificent air, the noble breath of life. It was a delightful exhilaration, but it soon passed off. It is impossible that the distribution of rewards hereafter should not be in gradation. How inconsistent with justice would it be that all boundless varieties of desert and condition should be leveled to a single lot, all, from the agonized martyr who was sawn asunder for the faith, to the deathbed of a modern Christian, where a soul which was never tempted, and a sinless innocence which was never tried, has sighed out a harmless life on beds of down, and accompanied and piloted to heaven by the prayerful sympathy of the saints on earth, in the manner of Everett. The other day read Edinburgh Review of Drummond's Academic Questions. The review and the reviewed are both beautiful specimens of an elegant metaphysical style. Attended Mr. Ticknor's lecture on Voltaire. The year has changed to 1821. The first journal entry here is January 9th, 1821. Have heard today another consecrated display of genius, of the insinuating and overwhelming effect of eloquent manners and style, when made sacred and impregnable by the subject which they are to enforce. Mr. Everett's sermon before the Howard Benevolent Society. He told a very affectionate anecdote. Quote, I have known a woman in this town go out to work with her own hands to pay for the wooden coffin which was to enclose the dust of her only child. I prayed with her when there was none to stand by her, but he who was to bear that dust to the tomb. End quote. There was a vast congregation, but while he spoke, as silent as death. Unluckily, in the pauses, however, they shook the house with their hideous convulsions. For when he raised his handkerchief to his face, after a pause in the sermon, it seemed almost a concerted signal for the Old South to cough. Let those now cough who never coughed before, and those who always cough, cough now the more. February 7th. The religion of my aunt is the purest and most sublime of any I can conceive. It appears to be based on broad and deep and remote principles of expediency and adequateness to an end, principles which few can comprehend and fewer feel. It labors to reconcile the apparent insignificancy of the field to the surpassing grandeur of the operator, and founds the benignity and mercy of the scheme on adventurous but probable comparisons of the condition of other orders of being. Although it is an intellectual offspring of beauty and splendor, if that were all, it breathes a practical spirit of rigid and austere devotion. It is independent of forms and ceremonies, and its ethereal nature gives a glow of soul to her whole life. She is the weird woman of her religion, and conceives herself always bound to walk in narrow but exalted paths, which lead onward to interminable regions of rapturous and sublime glory. March 14th. I am reading Price on Morals, and intend to read it with care and commentary. I shall set down here what remarks occur to me upon the matter or manner of his argument. On the 56th page, Dr. Price says that the right and wrong are not determined by any reasoning or deduction, but by the ultimate perception of the human mind. It is to be desired that this were capable of satisfactory proof, but as it is in direct opposition to the skeptical philosophy, it cannot stand unsupported by strong and sufficient evidence. I will, however, read more and see if it is proved or no. He saith that the understanding is the ultimate determiner. Cambridge, March 25th, Sabbath. I am sick. If I should die, what would become of me? We forget ourselves and our destinies in health, and chief use of temporary sickness is to remind us of these concerns. I must improve my time better. I must prepare myself for the great profession I have purposed to undertake. I am to give my soul to God and withdraw from sin and the world the idle or vicious time and thoughts I have sacrificed to them. And let me consider this as a resolution by which I pledge myself to act in all variety of circumstances, and to which I must recur often in times of carelessness and temptation, to measure my conduct by the rule of conscience. Cambridge, April 1st. It is Sabbath again, and I am for the most part recovered. Is it a wise dispensation that we can never know what influence our own prayers have in restoring the health we have prayed to God to restore? It has been thought by some that in these immediate effects they have no influence. In general, that their good is prospective, and that the world is governed by Providence through the instrumentality of general laws, which are only broken on the great occasions of the world or other portions of the Creator's works. But what have I wandered from? I think that it infinitely removes heavenly dispensations from earthly ones. This manner of giving gifts without expressing the reason for which they are bestowed, and leaving it to the heart to make the application, and to discover the giver, is worthy of a supreme ineffable intelligence. Well, I am sorry. The anecdote which I accidentally heard of, shows him more like his neighbors than I should wish him to be. I shall have to throw him up after all as a cheat of fancy. Before I ever saw him, I wished my friend to be different from any individual I had seen. I invested him with a solemn cast of mind, full of poetic feeling, and an idolater of friendship, and possessing a vein of rich, sober thought. For a year I have entertained towards him the same feelings, and should be sorry to lose him altogether before we have ever exchanged above a dozen words. May 2nd. I am more puzzled than ever with Blank's conduct. He came out to meet me yesterday, and I, observing him just before we met, turned another corner and most strangely avoided him. This morning I went out to meet him in a different direction and stopped to speak with the lounger in order to be directly in Blank's way. But Blank turned into the first gate and went towards Stoughton. All this took place without any apparent design and as soberly as if both were intent on some tremendous affair. May 10th. Huzzah for my magician! He engages me finely. I am interested in the tale and as anxious to know the end as any other reader could be. By the by, this tale of mine might be told with powerful effect by a man of good voice and natural eloquence. June 10th. Mr. Everett, in his artillery election sermon, to preface his own prophecy that the century now begun, i.e., third century since the Plymouth landing, will be the most important in determining the future fates of America, told this story. In 1417, when Huss was bound to the stake at Prague, he declared amid his tortures that after 100 years a retribution should be made on papacy. The inhabitants of Prague wrote his words post centum annos upon their standard and in their records, and in 1517 the Reformation by Luther began. Here is a list of books lent. Kett's Elements, both volumes, to Angier. Telemacha to Stackpole Stackpole 1. Lacroix to Gutterson. Locke, 2 volumes to Hill. 3 and 4 cantos of Childe Harold, both lost. Guy Mannering to Lane. Rhyming Dictionary to Williams, A.B. Blair's Rhetoric Abridgment to Hooper. Lay of the Last Minstrel, Lothrop. Lady of the Lake to Idem. Adam's Antiquities. Books in Querenda. Mather's Magnalia. Dunlop's History of Fiction. Matière. Swift, Froissart. Davies' Chemistry. Teignmouth's Life of Jones. Symonds's Life of Milton, 3 volumes of British Plutarch. Chaucer. Montaigne's Essays, Germany. Stahl. Drummond's Academical Questions. Price on Morals. Humboldt Work on America. Smith's Virginia. Robertson's S. America, History of Philip II, Life of Shakespeare. Subjects for themes: destruction of a city, poetry, forensic, whether civil government be founded on a compact expressed or implied, the domestic relations as restraints on an adventurous spirit, influence of weather on intellectual temperament, character of any fancy portrait, as for instance, and here it says one, and it says here in an annotated footnote 1, the hand written here points to a respectable sketch of a man of somewhat classic type, his head filleted, and below him a sea monster with the feet just bitten from the man in his mouth. In place of these, the man has miraculously grown a trifid fishtail on which he stands gracefully, and looking down on the monster with philosophic scorn, is saying on a scroll, "My feet are gone, I am a fish. Yes, I am a fish." End quote, and end of footnote. Authors or books quoted or referred to in journals of 1820 and 1821: Bible, Apocrypha, Pythagoras, Anaxagoras, Aristotle, Xenophon's and Plato's accounts of Socrates, Homer, Aeschylus, Sophocles, Euripides, Aristophanes, Erechilus, Theocritus, Kennett's Greek poets, Cicero, Lucretius, Virgil, Horace, Epictetus, Arrian, Marcus Antoninus, Epicurus, Zendavesta, Apud Gibbon, Arthurian romances, de Joinville, Chronicle of St. Louis, plays and masques of Shakespeare, Ben Jonson, The Alchemist, Beaumont and Fletcher, Massinger, Otway, Bacon, Novum Organum, Milton, Paradise Lost, Comus, Samson, Agonists. Reverend Isaac Barrow, Montaigne, Essays, Montesquieu, Letters, Persanes, Chateaubriand, Cowper, Task, Dryden, Absalom and Achitophel, Corneille, Racine, Hobbes, Swift, Sterne, Addison, Pope, Descartes, Cudworth, Locke, Wollaston, Shaftesbury, Mosheim, Hume's Essays, Priestley, Paley, Dugald Stewart, Dr. Reed, Dr. Price on Morals, Mellon on Divine Vengeance, Forsyth, Principles of Moral Science, Bishop Hall, Johnson, Lives of the Poets, Gibbon, Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, Burke, Regicide Peace, Bizzle, Life of Burke, Edward Searches, Abraham Tucker, Writings, Sismondi, History of the Italian Republics, Scott, Guy Mannering, Old Mortality, Monastery, and Minstrels of the Scottish Border, Lockhart, Spanish Ballads, Moore, Lalla Rookh, Campbell, Poems, Wordsworth, Excursion, Southey, Curse of Kehama, Byron, Manfred, Corsair and Childe Harold, Charles Lamb, Essays, Maclaurin, Life of Sir Isaac Newton, Dean Milman, Samor, The Lord of the Bright City and Fall of Jerusalem, Hillhouse, Percy's Mask, Bryant, Waterfowl and Murdered Traveler, Edward Everett's Lectures, Edinburgh and Quarterly Reviews. End of list. The Universe. Annotated description here. During the years 1820 and 1821, Emerson kept a quotation book, named as above, made up of passages from his miscellaneous reading in the college library or whatever other treasure houses of letters were open to him. These passages are neatly copied in a small hand-on-folio sheets, numbered, which were afterwards folded once and placed in a cover. The range is somewhat remarkable, and a list is given below. Spencer's View of the State of Ireland, Apud Wharton, Diversions of Queen Elizabeth's Maids of Honor, Harrison's Apud Holinshed's Chronicle, verses of Homer sung by him and a chorus of boys before the houses of rich men in Samos, original Greek and a metrical rendering, Apud Basil Kennett's Lives and Characters of the Greek Poets, 1697, Pope Gregory VII's excommunication of the Emperor Henry IV, Apud Barrington's Abelard and Heloisa, Queen Elizabeth's infatuation for the Earl of Leicester, Apud Camden's Annals Elizabethae, extract from a scene in Byron's Manfred, Chaucer's account of his sufferings in prison, extract from letter of Cicero to Plancus, Middleton's Cicero, extract from poem by Cornwall describing a pauper's burial, close of the conference between the Jewess Rebecca and Brian de Bois Gilbert in Scott's Ivanhoe, death and funeral of Spenser, Camden, Erasmus's Latin epigram of Sir Thomas More when he did not return the borrowed horse of the latter, alleged epitaph written by Virgil for himself, the pedantry of the times of Queen Elizabeth, Wharton, on the art of rhetoric, Richard Wilson, Apud Burnet, on Bessarion by Marcus Ficinus, Apud Hodi, De Gratias Illustribus, suppressed passage from Soliloquy of Bertram in play by Maturin, Apud Edinburgh Review, passage from Shipwreck in Byron's Don Juan, extract from sermon of Reverend Isaac Barrow on comparative ineffectiveness of human laws, concerning Shakespeare, Ben Jonson's discoveries, concerning Bacon, Collins's ode, How Sleep the Brave, extract from Hebrew Melodies, Byron, Meg Merrilies' denunciation of the Laird of Ellangowan, her prophecy of good to his son, Guy Mannering, on shaking off Cupid's yoke and on emulation, Shakespeare's Troilus and Cressida, Song of Runic Bard, quoted later in Poetry and Imagination and Letters and Social Aims, page 59, Godwin. Sforza's speech on his misfortunes, Duke of Milan, Massinger, Meditation on Conscience, Bishop Hall, concluding passage of C.W. Upham's oration, exhibition August 1820, The Shadowing Out of Paradise Lost, a long extract from Milton's Reasons of Church Government Urged Against Prelacy, beginning, Although a poet soaring in the high region of his fancies, with his garland and singing robes about him, etc. Speech of Sir Bohort over the dead body of Lancelot, Ellis's Specimens of Early English Romances, The Mourning Bride, Congreve, The Power of Chance and Human Inventions, Bacon, Novum Organum, Part 2, Section 2, Epitaph on Pizarro, Southey, long extract from Idealist, Drummond's Academical Questions, Reasonings a priori, Moral Outline, Dugald Stewart, The Angels, the Guides of the Heavenly Bodies, Sermon of Jeremy Taylor, Dialogue between a Tyrant and a Stoic, Arian Priestley's translation, favorite passage beginning The Unearthly Voices Ceased in Scott's Lay of the Last Minstrel, Canto 1, Dreams from the Castle of Indolence, Thomson, extracts from Scenes from Viola and the Duke in Twelfth Night, Shakespeare, Spenser's Lamentation, Mother Hubbard's Tale, The Nightingale, Thomson's Seasons, extract from the Magnalia Christi of Cotton Mather as to the number of settlers in Massachusetts Bay, Lord Bacon's expostulation with Queen Elizabeth in a letter to the Earl of Devonshire, song from Gypsy's Metamorphosed, Ben Jonson, Ode to Melancholy, The Passionate Madman, Beaumont and Fletcher, extract from Lord Harry's Complaint, C.K. Sharp, Apud Drake's Essays, The Origin of Fable, Eloge de Fontaine, The Mariner's Dream, Song of the Clown, Twelfth Night, The Lombards' Loss of Opportunity to Establish Federated Republics, Hallam's Middle Ages, Decline of Ecclesiastical Power of Rome, Hallam's Middle Ages, The Defense Power and Success of Federated Publics, Sismondi, Histores de Republiques Italiens de Moyen Age, The Bad Omens attending the commencement of hostilities when Charles I set up his standard at Nottingham, Clarendon's History, The Character of Cromwell, Clarendon's History, To the Herb Rosemary, H. Kirk White, Preface to one of Elizabeth's Costly Masks, Ben Jonson, To a Waterfowl, William Cullen Bryant, Close of the Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire from Gibbon's Memoirs of his own life and writings, A student's thought compared to a river which one undertakes to dam, Tucker's Edward Search, Light of Nature. Deliberation and investigation compared to the hunting of a hound, Tucker. Journal 5, The Wide World, number 3. There is an annotation introduction to this passage that I will read here. Emerson seems to have kept no journal for the last half of 1821. He had graduated in the summer of 1821, number 30 in a class of 59. His actual scholarship in the required branches must have been much lower, for it must be remembered that any misconduct might remove a greater or lesser number of marks for recitations. Hence, a boy of quiet disposition might stand in the end much higher than a brilliant but disorderly one. But Emerson nonetheless had night and day been educating himself in his own way. He came just within the number of those to whom quote-unquote parts at commencement were assigned, and in those days they were always delivered. His was the character of John Knox, and the colloquy on Knox, pen in Wesley, in which function he is said to have been rather negligent. He was class poet, a doubtful honor, as at least 6 had been asked before him and refused. His brother William, who graduated in 1818, was doing his best to maintain the family, and it became Waldo's duty to help, for the case was urgent. William, aged 22, had recently opened a finishing school for young ladies in Boston at his mother's house, and now offered his brother, aged 18, the place of assistant. It was a trying place for a bashful boy, unused to girls, but he accepted. Boston, January 12, 1822. After a considerable interval, I am still willing to think that these commonplace books are very useful and harmless things, at least sufficiently so to warrant another trial. Contrast. The principle of contrast which we find engraven within, how came it there? Whence did we derive it? Either the deity has written it as one of his laws upon the human mind, or we have derived it from an observation of the invariable course of human affairs. In this principle is lodged the safety of human institutions and human life. For suppose ambition excite against the peace of the world one of those incarnate fiends which have at different periods arisen to destroy the peace and good order of one community after another, and of nation after nation. Gradually the lust of excess, engendered by sudden prosperity, debauches every virtue and steals away the moral sense. The insolence of power tramples upon the laws of God and the rights of man. Here, when the day of triumph burns with consuming splendor, here the mind itself pauses to anticipate change near at hand. The victor must cease, else would the very stones cry out. Day and night contend against him. The elements which he wielded rebel and crush him. The clouds nurse their thunders to blast him. He is lifted up on rebellious spears between heaven and earth, unworthy and abhorred of both to perish. This next section is titled Tnamurya, which is a respelling of the name Aunt Mary, and there's an annotated note here. Shift of the letters of this word about, and they spell Aunt Mary. Her nephew thus marks the frequent passages from her letters to him which he copies into his journals. And I will end this footnote here. Quote, when that spell which can only be felt is thrown over the soul by the magic of genius. Now lettest thou thy servant depart where all is boundless genius, or let us tarry forever in this grave, if this illuminated is the adoring language of the heart. Is it not a well-known principle of human nature that moments of enthusiasm can produce sacrifices which demand no proportionate virtue to those which never pretend to fame? End quote. Religion. The invisible connection between heaven and earth, the solitary principle which unites intellectual beings to an account and makes of men moral beings, religion, is distinct and peculiar, alike in its origin and in its end, from all other relations. It is essential to the universe. You seek in vain to contemplate the order of things apart from its existence. You can no more banish this than you can separate from yourself the notions of space and duration. Through all the perverse mazes and shadows of infidelity, the light still makes itself visible until the reluctant mind shudders to acknowledge the eternal encompassing presence of Deity. If you can abstract it from the universe, the soul is bewildered by a system of things by which no account can be given, instances of tremendous power, and no hand found to form them, 1,000 creations in 1,000 spheres, all pointing upward to a single point, and no object there to see and receive. It is all a vast anomaly. Restore religion, and you give to those energies a sublime object. The history of religion involves circumstances of remarkable interest, and it is almost all that we are able to trace in the passage of the remote ages of the world. It is a beautiful picture, and just as it should be, that in the character of Noah, of Abraham, and the early denizens of the world, we trace no feature which does not belong peculiarly to their religion. It was their life. It was natural that when the mountains were just swelling upward under the hand of the Creator, when his bow was just built and painted in the sky, when the stone tables were yet unbroken by Moses, which now lie mouldering in fragments upon Sinai, that men should walk with God. As we come downward and leave the immediate precincts of the tabernacle, although we become sensible of the progressive departure from the truth, yet each superstition retains the inherent beauty of the first form, disguised and defaced in some degree by the ill-adjusted and needless apparel. Indeed, the only records by which the early ages of any nation are remembered is their religion. We know nothing of the first empires which grasped the scepter of the earth in Egypt, Assyria, or Persia, but their modes of worship. And this fact forcibly suggests the idea that the only true and legitimate vehicle of immortality, the only bond of connection which can traverse the long duration which separates the ends of the world and unites the first people to the knowledge and sympathy of the last people, is religion. We have said that the first nations were remembered by their religion, and in tracing down their history a little farther until the time of written languages, we find that the first efforts which the human genius made to commit its ideas to permanent signs were exercised upon the great topic which stood uppermost in an unperverted mind. Poetry attempted to fashion a probable picture of the creation, to explore the character of Providence, to impress upon mankind the enlightened views of a moral government in the world which had been disclosed to her own eye. But the date of writing marks the second age in the history of religion, and we have parted from the more attractive memory of the first. The naked savage who ascends the mountain because the dusky summit inclines him to believe that the Great Spirit inhabits there, and erects a stone as his simple and sincere tribute to the majesty of that being, is an object infinitely more agreeable to our imagination and feelings than the loftier and more excellent offering of lettered science. And although reason teaches us that the deliberate devotion of a philosophic mind is worth more than the vague fears of a superstitious one, yet we are apt to inquire if the pride of learning has not been known to harden the mind even to the plain proofs of divine providence. The difference between the primitive forms of religion and the second dispensation, and likewise the first, consisted in this, that the first were the voluntary offerings of the imagination and the understanding to a sublime but unseen spirit, and the last were the implicit submissions of duty, of custom, of fear. For this reason we sympathize more with the savage. It is somewhat remarkable that, in the simple institutions of the barbarous nations, God was worshipped through sublime and awful images, and nothing mean and disgusting was attributed to his character. It were needless to repeat that Caesar found the German nations without idols, deeming it unworthy to build a house for him that made the universe, or to transcribe the Indian creed of the Great Spirit, so scrupulously pure that it rejected what it could not reconcile of an evil world to a benevolent cause, and created an opposite active evil principle on which to pile the sin and the storm, pain, and death which beset human life. Such also was the Persian faith, which thought the fire no unfit emblem of divinity. And if the Druids sacrificed men on the altar, an oak forest was the temple, and it was not offered to an ox or an ass, but to an adequate notion of the Supreme Being. In all these ways of providence were traced in hurricane, the sea, the cloud, or the earthquake, and therefore the mind must needs be elevated that would converse with them. But as civilized life advanced and civil and social institutions were erected, and life became more intellectual, devotion was degraded by a profane and vulgar idolatry. The gods and demigods went fast below the standard of human respectability until the worship of superior beings, the holiest feeling of which the human soul is capable, and that perhaps for which it was made, seems to have almost passed out of repute and name among honest patriots, and Olympus needed to be cleaned of its impurities, and the thrones of heaven to be subverted for the peace of society. This fact that the seeds of corruption are buried in the causes of improvement strikes us everywhere in the political, moral, and national history of the world. It seems to indicate the intentions of Providence to limit human perfectibility and to bind together good and evil, like life and death, by indissoluble connection. The idea of power seems to have been everywhere at the bottom of the theology. The human mind has a propensity to refer all its higher feelings, all its veneration for virtue and greatness, to something wherein this attribute is supposed to reside. Cause and effect is another name for the direction of this sentiment. What are honor, mercy, pride, humility, revenge, but sensations which have reference to indwelling power? Honor is the worthiness which it gives. Mercy, the temperate forbearance of its exercise. Pride, the self-respect which attends its possession. Humility, the acknowledgement of its existence. Revenge, a barbarous use to which it is put. It is shared among all beings, but in all has a limit and a beginning on which the mind's eye eagerly fastens with an immediate attempt to trace the sources whence the subtle principle was derived. It is a great flood which encircles the universe and is poured out in unnumbered channels to feed the fountains of life and the wants of creation, but everywhere runs back again and is swallowed up in its eternal source. That source is God. Will the disputes upon the nature of God, upon Trinitarianism, upon Unitarianism, never yield to a purer pursuit and to practical inquiry? It is possible, for all we know to the contrary, that God may exist in a threefold unity, but if it were so, since it is inconceivable to us, he would have never revealed to us such an existence, which we cannot describe or comprehend. Infinite wisdom established the foundations of knowledge in the mind, so that twice two could never make anything else than four. As soon as this can be otherwise, our faith is loosened and science abolished. Three may be one, and one three. Of poetry. It is the language of the passions which do not ordinarily find their full expression in the sober strains of prose. We should rest our argument on this, that there seems to be a tendency in the passions to clothe fanciful views of objects in beautiful language. It seems to consist in the pleasure of finding out a connection between a material image and a moral sentiment. Few men are safe when they begin to describe poetry. They talk at random or hardly prevent the ends of the lines from rhyming, and are like the mimic of a madman who went mad himself. Poetry never offers a distinct set of sensations. Science penetrates the sky. Philosophy explains its adaptation to our wants, and poetry grasps at its striking phenomena and combines them with the moral sentiment which they naturally suggest. Its images are nothing but the striking occurrences selected from nature and art and clothed in an artful combination of sounds. But poetical expression constitutes to half the world the beauty of poetry, and in this it seems to resemble algebra, for both make language an instrument and depend solely upon it without having any abstracted use. There are few things which the well wishers of American literature have more at heart than our national poetry. For everything else, for science and morals and art, they are willing to wait the gradual development. But they are in haste to pluck the bright blossoms from the fair tree which grows fast by the hill of Parnassus. For when a nation has found time for the luxury and refinement of poetry, it takes off the reproach of a sluggish genius and of ignorant indifference. Poetical expression serves to embellish dull thoughts, but we love better to follow the poet, when the muse is so ethereal and thought so sublime that language sinks beneath it. Drama. Saturday evening, January 19th. When a species of composition has been written with success in a brilliant period, and another in remote land has been likewise known, and after having been discontinued and forgotten, is revived in another age and another country, we have every right to say that such an art is agreeable to the dictates of nature. This is the history of the drama, and it is every reasonable indication that it will everywhere flourish under favorable circumstances. It is easy also to distinguish between those parts of it which are unnatural and the forced production of a state of society, and those which are the genuine offspring of the human spirit. In the Mysteries, the French drama of the Middle Ages, such personages were introduced upon the stage as such, each one and both, and performed their parts as gravely and as much to the satisfaction of a perverted public taste as did ever the most accomplished Iphigenia, Electra, Caesar. Such a folly as this is evidently the appropriate spawn of the age of the schools and the pleasantry of confirmed pedantry. It does not follow that, if anything be out of the common course of human experience, it is not natural to the drama and may not talk with ordinary agents. The representation of the dead consorts perfectly with the feelings of the most refined taste, and in every age has formed a part of dramatic entertainment. For the belief in unseen agents is so universal, and indeed is a consequence of a belief in God, that no mind ever revolts at the idea. A constituent part of the drama from its very invention was the ornament of scenery. This suggests itself unavoidably as an important element of the plan which acts altogether by deceiving the audience into a conviction that the actors really are the persons whom they represent. The illusion could be best promoted by removing all extraneous circumstances and affording the imagination the help of all the senses. Independently of this, it is a high gratification to be suddenly removed from all the common objects of daily occurrence and admitted to a spectacle of shining cities, of imposing mountain scenery, of thrones, and of magnificent apparel. May. I rejoice in Shakespeare's empire as far as it is reckless of that learning which some dotards make a merit of, but as sustained on the sensual, regret and abhor his dominion. It is for a still brighter era to erase his deformities and possibly set a mightier magician over the witcheries of fancy. But to me, to his old admirers, nothing could supply his place. A Venture in Romance. I was the pampered child of the East. I was born where the soft western gale breathed upon me the fragrance of cinnamon groves, and through the 70 windows of my hall the eye fell on the Arabian harvest. 100 elephants apparelled in cloth and of gold carried my train to war, and the smile of the great king beamed upon Omar. But now the broad Indian moon looks through the broken arches of my tower, and the wing of desolation fans me with poisonous airs. The spider's threads are the tapestry which adorns my walls, and the rain of the night is heard in my halls for the music of the daughters of Kashmir. Wail, wail for me, ye who put on honor as gay drapery. Idealism, and this is a poem. Deep in the soul a strong delusion dwells, a curious round of fairy fashioned dreams. Yet quietly the pleasant vision swells, its gay proportion far around the streams of the wide universe their wealth supply. Their everlasting sources furnish forth the fabled splendors whose immortal dye colors the scene with hues which mock the summer sky. And oh, how sweetly in youth's seraph soul that vision like the light of heaven doth rest. Its name is life, its hours their circle roll, like angels in the robes of morning dressed. And every phantom of the train is blessed, who shakes his plumes upon the odorous air, or lights a star upon his azure crest. And while the lovely beam reposes there, joy in the guileless heart his welcome will prepare. The circle of the sciences is no more firmly bound together than the circle of the virtues. But in the first, a man cannot hope to be thoroughly acquainted with all, for they are in some degree incompatible. Whereas in the last, his character will be defective if it do not combine the whole and form that harmony which results from all. And that is the end of Emerson's journal number 5 and the Wide World number 3. In the next video, we will pick up the journals with journal number 6, which is also titled The Wide World number 4. Thank you for listening.